All right, so today we're covering gerrymandering. So today's session is going to be a little bit different than past sessions. I wanted to spend more time going over the primary source you're looking at this week for sources in history, because number one, the language is still older style English, and number two, this is an example of satire, which sometimes people really struggle with understanding. So we're going to kind of walk through the source in a little bit more detail today. We're going to talk then about how gerrymandering impacts us still today, and why we always say this about every election. Every election is important, but why this one is really important in the context of gerrymandering. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the present today than is normal, because this is still a topic that has a lot of bearing on our life today. All right. So, let's see. Now my computer's being slow. Go. Okay. So first of all, let's kind of gauge how much you already know about this. Anybody want to take a stab at defining what is gerrymandering? It's a weird word, right? What is gerrymandering? Raise your hand if you have no idea what gerrymandering is. Okay, yeah, a couple of you are like, I have no clue. That's what you're here today, right? So Mary says in the chat, when people redraw lines to benefit certain political parties, yes. And we're going to talk about what those lines are that Mary's referring to. We're going to talk about how those came about and how they're still affecting us today. So, Gabriel, did you have a question, or are you still working on lowering your hand?
Okay, I'm just working on lowering my hand.
Okay. I love that everybody's like computers are a little sluggish today. That's fine. I just always want to make sure if you have questions, I don't want to miss them. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about gerrymandering. So the Constitution, remember, was created before the evolution of political parties in the United States. And when it comes to gerrymandering, gerrymandering originates from Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. This is the part of the Constitution that talks about representation in the House of Representatives. So there are two parts of Section 2 that are kind of important for us to understand, to be able to understand gerrymandering. The first part here is talking about the number of representatives. So the Constitution says the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. So here they're kind of dictating what the population requirement is before you start adding or subtracting representatives. So it's saying that, as we already learned, right, when we talked about the Constitution, the House of Representatives is based on population, right? So a more populous state like Texas has more representatives than, say, a state like Alaska or Wyoming. Okay, but every state should have at least 1 representative, according to the Constitution. Then how do you count that population? How frequently do you do it? So here in Section 2, it says representatives and also taxes shall be apportioned on several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, which is referencing what? People bound to terms of service. Remember the definition or the term for that? You wrote about them for your short essay. Yes, Lavender.
Indentured servants?
Correct, indentured servants, right? So free persons, indentured servants, excluding Indians not taxed, right? So it says we're not counting Native Americans, right? Because remember, the Constitution defines them as a separate nation. 3/5 of all other persons. Who is this referencing? 3/5 of all other persons. That should ring some bells. Yes, Thomas.
Slaves.
Slaves, correct. Okay. So they're saying, here's who we count, right? We're counting free persons, we're counting indentured servants, we're not counting Native Americans, right? Because they're not considered part of the United States. And we are going to count 3/5 of the slave population. All right. And then it tells you how often to do it. It says the actual enumeration, or the counting, shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress and within every subsequent term of 10 years. So what is this talking about? Every 10 years we count. What do we know that as? We're going to do an updated population count every 10 years. What is that called? The census. Correct, Mary, the census. Okay. Now, 2020 is a census year, right? So the census was going on right now. Usually it goes on till the end of the year, but was recently suspended early. Okay. So every 10 years, so the Constitution says every 10 years, we have to have a census, right? What's the purpose of having the census every 10 years? What impact does that have on the House of Representatives? Anybody know? Right, your representation. People move around, right? So the census allows you to update. Maybe you need to add more seats, right? If Texas has gained population, or maybe you need to subtract some seats if, people are moving out of a certain state, right? So this kind of adjusts the representation based on your population. So the goal is to keep the representation pretty constant as outlined by the Constitution, right? The proportion of the population that needs a representative. All right. Do you have a question, Lavender? No? Okay. All right. Okay, so this is where gerrymandering comes from, right? Because it says House of Representatives, the representation has to be based on a certain number of population, and it's based on the census. Okay. So gerrymandering, as Mary mentioned, is drawing political lines, right? The electoral districts based on population, but to favor one political party. Because the Constitution, when it was created, had no political parties. And so they simply kind of thought that we were going to draw districts solely based on population, right? Like this district has this many people, and then this district has, same amount of people, etc. So this is about manipulating how these districts are drawn, because the Constitution does not explicitly say anything about political parties or balance, right, between political parties. So gerrymandering is named after Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And this term first appears in 1812 in the newspaper, the Boston Gazette. So that's what we're going to look at right now, is we're going to look at that original editorial. We're actually going to look at the updated version from 1820 that kind of added sort of what happened after 1812, after the first sort of editorial was published. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, do we still see gerrymandering today, and how does it impact us? All right. So this is the source we're going to, I love how my placeholder gibberish is still at the bottom. I forgot to take that out. This is the source we're going to be looking at for your sources and history assignment. We're going to be looking at analyzing it and breaking it down by chunks today together. So that way we make sure everybody's on the same page with what it has in it. So originally, this source, the Natural and Political History of the Gerrymander, was a newspaper column, kind of what we would call today an op-ed, right? An opinion editorial from 1812 in the Boston Gazette. The version we're reading today was the sort of updated version published in 1820. This is an example of satire. Does anybody know what satire is? What is satire? Any ideas? Yes, Mary's correct. Making fun of something to prove a point. So satire takes something and kind of heightens up the absurdity or the ridiculousness to prove a point about it, right? To kind of highlight the natural absurdity of something, they just kind of jack it up a couple notches. Satire is sometimes difficult for people to understand unless you're in on the joke. So a great example of modern satire that actually popped up in the news last week was the satire site, the Babylon Bee. Anybody catch that on Twitter? President Trump was retweeting something from the Babylon Bee, thinking that it was a reputable source, right? Not recognizing that it was satire. The Onion is another kind of example of a satire site that the headlines are so close to kind of the ridiculousness of our reality. Sometimes people confuse it for an actual newspaper outlet, right? And not a satire site. So you got to be careful with satire that you make sure you understand the joke and that you don't mistake it for a completely sort of serious matter-of-fact thing. Okay. Now, what's the historical context of this particular source? Lots of rivalries between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, right? We already talked about that when you guys wrote about the Sedition Act, right? In an earlier week in your sources of history assignment, right? About John Adams trying to shut down criticism and dissent against his Federalist government. We're going to see happen after the initial publication of this column is that the Federalist Party actually collapses in 1815 because of the War of 1812. And then we end up in what historians nickname the era of good feelings, where there's really only one political party, the Democratic Republicans, for about 10 years. And then we get the birth of the modern Democratic Party after the election of 1824, when Andrew Jackson loses to John Quincy Adams, and the supporters of Jackson break off to form a new party, the Democrats. So that's kind of the context of what's going on here. The gerrymander is born in a time of competition, intense competition between two political parties, but then there's a collapse of one of them, and we enter this weird sort of twilight zone of only one political party for about a decade before we kind of have a two-party system restored after 1825. So any questions so far? All right, so let's look at it together. I kind of broke it apart paragraph by paragraph. So we're going to go through, and I highlighted or underlined the most important things. All right, remember, we're talking about a satire here. So again, we kind of have to take with a grain of salt some of the things that it says. This is the original cartoon that accompanied the article. Okay, so this is a political cartoon from 1812. So let's go over it together and make sure we kind of understand what's fiction and what's reality. The horrid monster of which this drawing is a correct representation appeared in the county of Essex during the last session of the legislature. Various and manifold have been the speculations and conjectures among learned naturalists respecting the genus and origin of this astonishing production. Some believe it to be the real basilisk, a creature which had been supposed to exist only in the poet's imagination. Others pronounce it the serpens monocephalus of Pliny, or single-headed hydra, a terrible animal of pagan extraction. Many are of the opinion that it is the griffin or hippogriff of romance which flourished in the Dark Ages, and has come hither to assist the knight of the rueful countenance in restoring that gloomy period of ignorance, fiction, and impatience. My screenshot is covering that. Some think it is the great red dragon, or Bunyan's Apollyon, or the monstrum horrendum of Virgil, and all believe it is of infernal origin, both from its aspect and the circumstance of its birth. Now, are we talking fiction or reality here with this paragraph? When we're talking about basilisks and hippogriffs.
Fiction.
Fiction, right. You're just like, hey, Harry Potter. Okay. Yeah, so basically what the author is trying to say here is that this creation is monstrous, and he's comparing it to sort of fictional monsters of yore, right? So that's kind of a tip off to us that during this essay, he's going to kind of treat this redrawing of an electoral district as sort of a living, breathing monster, right? So that's his category, is that this creation is so monstrous, he's kind of giving life to it like these fictional monsters like hippogriffs and basilisks, okay? So a creature of infernal origin, both from its aspect and from the circumstance of its birth. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? So here he's kind of laying out how monstrous he thinks this creation is by name checking, right? Mythical monsters. All right, moving on. Don't be afraid of this wall of text. But the learned Dr. Watergruel, this is a fictional person, right? He's creating this fictional expert on monsters to talk to. The learned Dr. Watergruel, who's famous for peeping under the skirts of nature, has decided that it belongs to the salamander tribe and gives many plausible reasons for this opinion. So this is where we get the name gerrymander. If we go back and look at the image, Gerry from Elbridge Gerry, right, the governor of Massachusetts, and then the mander part comes from this being sort of like a salamander in the way that it's curving around. And if you haven't picked up on it here, the sort of monster here is an electoral district, right? A weirdly shaped one. So because it's shaped like a salamander, right, and he attributes it to Elbridge Gerry, that's why it's given the name the gerrymander. All right, so our fictional Dr. Watergruel here says, though the devil himself undoubtedly must have been concerned, either directly or indirectly, in the procreation of this monster, yet many powerful causes must have concurred to give its existence, amongst which must be reckoned the present combustible and venomous state of affairs. So he says this creature is so horrific, the devil is involved in creating it. But then he specifically says, well, we can't just blame the devil for this creation. We also have to recognize, when he says the present combustible and venomous state of affairs, what do you think he's referring to? What does this sound like to you? Combustible, venomous. Okay, Esmeralda says incest. Politics, yeah. Incest is an interesting interpretation of this. I don't think I've seen that before. Yeah, politics. He's using lots of fancy words and convoluted nature to say politics. That basically politics has gotten really ugly, and that the gerrymander is born of this ugly politics. There have been, says the doctor, many fiery ebullitions. Ebullitions is a fancy word that says, like, this means outbursts. Many fiery ebullitions of party spirit, many explosions of democratic wrath, and fulminations of gubernatorial vengeance. Gubernatorial is an adjective that means of the governor. Okay, so when he says gubernatorial vengeance, he's basically saying that Elbridge Gerry is lashing out against his opponents. All right, within the year past, which would naturally produce an uncommon degree of inflammation and acrimony in the body politics. So he's saying here that both sides, both political parties, have really been kind of ugly with one another, that Elbridge Gerry has been sort of very vindictive towards the opposing political party. But as the salamander cannot be generated except in the most potent degree of heat, he thinks these malignant causes could not alone have produced such diabolical effects. He therefore ascribes the real birth and material existence of this monster and all its horrors to the alarm with his last speech, his libelous message, and a numerous litter of new judges and other animals, of which he has since been happily delivered. So basically he's saying that just because politics is ugly is not reason enough for the existence of the gerrymander. The author's placing a lot of blame at the feet of Elbridge Gerry, the governor. He's saying that he's giving kind of inflammatory speeches that verge on libel. The appointment of new judges, because remember, just like at the federal level, the executive branch gets to nominate judges. So we see that at the state level, right, the executive branch being represented by the governor, right, gets to appoint judges. This fright and perturbation, which means disturbance, was occasioned by an incendiary letter threatening him with firebrands, arrows, and death if his proclamation is to be credited, which was sent to him by some mischievous wight, probably some rogue of his own party, to try the strength of his excellency's mind. So basically, somebody sent him a very inflammatory message. So someone sort of put him on blast, to use modern language. Now his excellency, being somewhat like a tinderhorn, and his party very liable to take fire. So tinderhorn means like it's the old-timey word for fire starter, right? So basically, he's saying here that he was kind of like a match. His party was already flammable, right? They must, of course, have been thrown into a most fearful panic, extremely dangerous persons in their situation, and calculated to produce the most disastrous effects upon their unborn progeny. So he's, again, kind of accusing Gerry of causing the birth of this redistricting scheme by saying that he was responding to being provoked and that his political party did nothing to keep him in check on this. So any questions so far? So he was the start of modern day social media. I mean, definitely. A lot of scholars actually talk about coffee houses as being the internet of the 1700s. Definitely, there's lots of analogs to modern social media in politics, particularly when we talk about Andrew Jackson. We're talking about, like, imagine if Twitter existed at that time. We would have so many Twitter beefs between Jackson and John Quincy Adams, in particular, in the election of 1824. Adams famously said that Jackson was a barbarian who could not utter a sentence of grammar. And Jackson responded basically by saying that John Quincy Adams was an elitist and you should elect somebody you want to sit down and have a beer with. So, all right. Okay, here's where we get into the nitty-gritty. So before, he's just kind of talking about how monstrous the gerrymander is, how he blames Elbridge Gerry, right, for its creation. So here we're talking about we're going to deal with actual, like, reality and facts, right, statistics. It is well known that the two political parties, by which he means Federalists and Democratic Republicans, in Massachusetts have been for many years nearly equally divided. The balance, however, generally inclining to the federal side. So he says elections have been pretty competitive. Okay. For 6 successive years previous to the birth of the gerrymander, the representation of the parties in the Senate, as chosen by the people, was divided in the following manner, and he gives this table here. Okay. The vacant districts were so equally divided that no choice could be made by the people, and the vacancies were filled according to the political character of the other branch of the legislature. So in this case, when he's talking about vacancies, he's talking about districts that were so close that they were tied. And so basically the tiebreaker was the House of Representatives here that kind of picked the tiebreakers. So you can see, looking at this chart, right, it is really competitive. They're very close in all these different years. You can see that the legislature changes hands between the federal and Democratic Party several times, right? They're very close together. In the year 1811, both the branches of the legislature and the governor were, with the exception of a single year, for the first time Democratic, by which he means Democratic Republican. But the experience of past years taught the prevailing party that the tenure of their power was extremely precarious, and that the smallness of their majority in the Senate was sometimes, from the superiority of talents on the other side, quite embarrassing. So basically, he's saying that when Massachusetts elected a governor and a House and Senate that were all the same political party, they looked back at this pattern, right, of balance of power shifting every election cycle, and they thought that, looking at the numbers, that they were kind of going to be on the downward swing, right? So basically what he's saying is that Gerry and his fellow Democratic Republicans see this as an opportunity. They're in control, they're in power, they control both the executive and then both houses of the legislature. Let's do something to ensure that we continue to have a little bit more control. So how do they do that? The senatorial districts have been formed according to the natural and most obvious construction of the Constitution without any division of counties. So what he's saying here is that originally the electoral districts are pretty much just chosen by population. Okay. To effect the desired object of securing a decided majority in the Senate in all future years, the legislature divided the state into new senatorial districts in such a manner as to produce the election of the greatest number of Democratic Republican senators. Okay, so here he's saying that they take advantage, because remember, the census is every 10 years. So 1810 would have been a census year. So now they're saying that they're changing the rules for how the districts are redrawn, and they're doing it to give advantage to the Democratic Republican Party. They not only divided counties to effect their object in opposition to the powerful arguments of the federal members who urged the unconstitutionality of such a measure, but they divided the counties of Essex and Worcester. Yes, that is pronounced Worcester if you're from Massachusetts, even though it looks like it should be Worcester. In a manner which showed that all considerations of convenience or propriety, were disregarded. So he's saying here that they're carving up counties in a way that doesn't make sense. Okay, they're doing what we would today call, we're going to talk about different kinds of gerrymandering, but the two main versions of gerrymandering is called packing and cracking. So you're trying to kind of manipulate who gets elected by where you put people who lean one way or the other politically. Okay. So he's saying that rather than kind of having that sort of natural boundaries based solely on population, now they're drawing all these really weirdly shaped districts. This will appear from the following plan of the two Essex districts, in which the double dotted lines show the boundaries of the districts as they were formed by the districting law of 1811, commonly called the gerrymander law. So you can kind of see here by some of these dotted lines, right, they're kind of splitting apart certain areas that previously had been joined. Okay. Any questions so far? So here he's telling us what they did, right? So there's an actual law, which he nicknames the gerrymander law, in 1811 passed to redraw these districts based on the 1810 census. Okay, and in this case, the Democratic Republicans, because they have control, are drawing the districts in a new weird way to privilege them and give them more power. All right, so here in this section, he's talking about the effects of this law. Okay, so he kind of laid out who he blames for it, right? The circumstances leading up to it, and then how they drew new districts, and now he's telling us about the results. The gerrymander did not disappoint the expectations of its fond parents. The election of senators in 1812 took place under the gerrymander law, and the result was that 29 Democratic and only 11 federal senators were chosen. So this is a big jump from that chart, right, where pretty much they were just about even Steven. Now there's a much more lopsided election of Democratic Republican candidates. On the same day, the federal candidate for governor was chosen by a handsome majority. And what is more remarkable, such was the malignant influence of the animal of which we are giving the history, that it required fewer Democratic voters to choose the 29 Democratic senators that were actually given to the federal candidates, of whom 11 were chosen. So what Jerry is saying is because the governor is elected statewide by the popular vote, he's using that as evidence to show how the electoral districts are rigged, because he's saying here the candidate for governor ended up being a Federalist, showing that most voters in Massachusetts, at least a slim majority, were voting Federalist. So that showed up in the governor. But with the electoral districts, because they were drawn in a weird way, even though most of the voters were voting Federalist, the majority of the people elected were Democratic Republican. You with me so far? Raise your hand if you're not completely lost yet. Okay. And it's okay if you're a little lost. It's what we're going to be kind of breaking down in more detail. All right, so then he kind of gives us a little bit more facts. The whole number of votes for senators was 101,930, of which 51,766, or half, roughly, a little more than half, of the votes cast were given to federal candidates. making a federal majority of 1602 votes, yet the Democratic minority, with the help of the gerrymander, outvoted the federal majority almost 3-1. So here again, he's kind of giving us more statistics. He's saying, look, the voting patterns were still roughly half and half between political parties, but because the districts were drawn the way they were, despite the fact that only half the population voted Democratic Republican, the majority of the people elected were Democratic Republican. All right. One fact remained to be recorded of this monster. By the way, this is the last paragraph, and then we'll actually get into like less wordy slides. Thus far, his career has been prosperous, and all the fond hopes of his parents and friends were gratified in his complete dominance. So basically, he's saying the gerrymander worked. It worked the way it was intended, right? Alas, for the frailty of human expectations, especially when founded on schemes of fraud and unfairness, the public were indignant at the gross usurpation. To usurp something means to kind of steal or overthrow. The gross usurpation upon their rights. They rose in their strength, burst the chains which had been imposed upon them, and overcame the monster, notwithstanding his great power. So here he's saying that people got really mad at the fact that their votes were manipulated in such a way. And so he's saying that the people rose up and complained about this law. A new districting law was passed, by which he was deprived of all political authority, and it was reported that he was dead. So he, in this case, means the gerrymander, right, as the sort of personified monster. So he's saying the people rose up, they passed a new law, and killed the gerrymander. Okay. We have even seen an account of his funeral, but it is now after a past of some years. So this end part is the updated 1820, right? So he's saying what happens in the long term to the gerrymander. Some apprehensions of public have been quieted, confidently reported that it was but an empty coffin that was that was followed to the tomb. So he's saying people thought they killed the gerrymander, but he's not dead yet. Okay. The gerrymander still lives, and is the determination of his friends to restore him to power. I hate that my menu bar is right over this. Reputation in the Commonwealth, this attempt will not be successful. So basically he's saying that the kerfuffle over the gerrymander is quieted down, and people want to bring it back, right? They want to restore the idea of the gerrymander, and that he hopes that this will not be successful. And remember, the updated version of this is published in 1820, which again would be an election year and a census year. So the author basically is coming back to the original editorial to be like, look, don't get complacent. You're not safe from gerrymandering. Based on the outcome of this election in a census year, we might see it come back. Okay. All right, we're done with the wordiness. Any questions so far? Do you understand this source a little better now? Hopefully I've made it a little easier to understand for your sources and history assignment. Okay. So again, it's satire. So the thing you need to know about satire, right, is he's depicting the gerrymander as this literal monster, right, that's come alive, right? So that's kind of the more fantastical part of this. But the sort of hard facts and statistics part of it is him talking about how ugly politics kind of birthed this thing, how people responded to it, what the effect was, right? So that's where you can kind of sort out fact from fiction. All right. So how does gerrymandering work? The way you draw the districts determines how the gerrymander goes. I mentioned that packing and cracking and passing, right? How you put people in districts is a big factor of this, and those are indeed the two most popular gerrymanders. I'm not gonna show this video to y'all because copyright, but I will put it in Blackboard for you to watch to help you with this assignment. Come on. Okay. So gerrymandering basically assumes that you can draw districts to favor one party over another. So in this kind of example here, we have 50 precincts or electoral districts, and the voters living in these districts tend to vote about 60% for this fictional green party and 40% for the yellow party. So here you can see different gerrymanders to benefit different parties. So in the first one, so each of these we have 5 districts. Okay. So these are electoral districts based on the people living there. So in this one, if you draw lines straight across where this population lives, you end up with only green representation or victories, because all of the yellow voters are in the minority in each district. On the second one, in order to get a yellow majority, because remember, yellow is only 40% of the voting population, they draw them like Tetris pieces. So you can see here, at least like with this one in the center, you're like, okay, that at least looks even, like the districts aren't weirdly shaped. But in this one, it is very weirdly shaped in order to get the majority that they want. So in this case here, you would have, rather than 5 green representatives, you would elect 2 green and 3 yellow because of the way that they're shaped. Okay, so it's all about where you draw lines. So another way to look at this is, again, talk about different kinds of gerrymandering. The first 2 are the most common, and this is about where you draw the lines around your voters. So packing refers to concentrating your opponent's party into a few districts. So you can see here on the image that we have a competitive electoral map would kind of evenly split everybody. So in this case, we're drawing 4 districts with our hypothetical population. The lines are very clear, and the left side that's labeled the competitive district, and really the red and blue dots are kind of evenly distributed so that it could go either way. Okay. With packing, what's happened is that the blue dots, the blue party here, has basically created this weird, crazy district of all red dots. Kind of looks, again, sort of like a squiggly line, and made it so that there are some red dots in other districts, but they are outnumbered. Okay. So concentrating your opponent's party into a few districts so that way, again, they do win races, but not as many. So in this scenario, you would probably always reliably get a red dot as your representative out of this district. Okay, that's going to be a safe district for them, but they're never going to be as competitive in the other 3 districts because of the way that they're drawn. Cracking is about diluting your opponent's party across several districts. So this is the opposite of this. If this concentrates all of your opponents into a small area, this other one basically spreads them out so that they're never going to be in the majority in any one district. So here, the red party's done this. They've kind of spread out the blue voters between these different blocks and made it so that, again, they're there, they're present, but they just don't have the numbers to be able to win. Okay. These are the 2 most common forms of gerrymandering, is either about concentrating or spreading out your opponent's voting population across districts. The other 2 are about trying to eliminate elected representatives of your opponent's party. So hijacking, basically you're going to draw a new district that puts together 2 incumbents and that forces them to run against each other. So basically this would be if you have, like, let's say we're going to use red and blue dots here. This would be if you redraw these lines to make it so that now you would have, like, say, these 2 at the top of the packing, the top 2 squares. If you redrew the lines to have the representative for each of those blue squares have to run against each other for now 1 spot. This means you're automatically going to eliminate 1 of those blue representatives because now you've combined them into the same district. Kidnapping is when you redraw districts that places an incumbent's home in another district. So let's say this guy right here in the middle is in this district. Let's say you redraw him, so now all of a sudden he's in another district and he now has to run against somebody else. So these are about kind of more defeating people who have already been elected by changing the terms. of the districts. All right, you with me so far? We're almost done. So why is gerrymandering important? Well, for a couple of reasons. Does your vote really count equally if your district is gerrymandered? I mean, that's a big question, right? Also, the rights of minority political groups. I mean, if you have, you know, a state government that's dominated by one political group, gerrymandering can make that domination worse by concentrating minority political voters into very small districts. There's also the balance of power in National Congress. We see this with national elections like this year, right? For example, since 2000, there have been a number of elections in which the winner of the popular vote does not win the presidency, right? Because the Electoral College. So kind of similarly, if you looked at the breakdown of these numbers by gerrymandering, you could have a proportion of votes that go to one party, but that doesn't translate into winning for that party based on how the elections are drawn. Just like the author of the editorial, right, the satire, was talking about how, okay, well, over 50% of voters voted for this political party, but that wasn't the result in the election of the people who were elected representatives. So gerrymandering has a lot of implications. So the gerrymander, as the editorial writer said, did not die. He lived. With the rebirth of the two-party system, the gerrymander comes back. And we still deal with gerrymandering today. The Supreme Court most recently took on gerrymandering in Russo et al. Versus Common Cause et al. Last year in 2019. And the Supreme Court basically said in that ruling that it was not the duty of the Supreme Court to wade into gerrymandering. A lot of people were trying to appeal to the Supreme Court, making the argument that gerrymandering violated the 14th Amendment, right? Your equal protection under law, by basically making it so that some voters didn't have like the same power or say because of how their districts were drawn. And the Supreme Court basically said, nope, this is a problem for Congress, not for us. We're not touching this with a 10-foot pole. Because this is a census year, this is a really important year when it comes to gerrymandering, because the census, the population count that we've taken in 2020, will be what determines shifts in seats in 2021 and beyond. So basically, whoever we elect this year will go on to draw the maps that will be used starting in 2022 for midterm elections. So that's the other important piece, is not only it's the census, making sure you have an accurate count of your population. Thomas says the Supreme Court basically said we will not poke the bear. Correct. So whoever we elect this year is going to be in charge of who draws the maps for the next 10 years. So that's part of the reason why people are saying, you know, when you go to vote, don't just vote for president and then leave. Like, it's really important who you vote for your state representatives in your state House and Senate, because they're going to be the people in charge of drawing the boundary lines. Some states have embraced this idea of independent commissions. So basically they're like, you know what, we're going to appoint like a data scientist or a mathematician or, you know, some other people to try to draw lines fairly. But for the most part, most states, basically whoever wins control of the state legislature in a census year election, they're going to draw the lines. We can see the impact of gerrymandering in Texas, particularly because of the Supreme Court ruling of Shelby County v. Holder, which gutted parts of the Voting Rights Act from 1965, particularly the part of the act that stipulated what we call preclearance. So basically the Voting Rights Act had stated that you had to, if you were a state with a track record of discrimination, or like a local area with a track record of discrimination, if you wanted to pass any new laws about voting, you had to first prove that it wasn't going to discriminate against voters, right? So there was like a check system before it ever went into effect. When the Supreme Court removed that, what ended up happening was that states now didn't have to get that pre-clearance, and they could just pass a whole bunch of laws making changes to voting and districts and how they were drawn. So what ends up happening is this kind of worsens gerrymandering because it affects the voters and who can vote and who has access to voting, how easy it is to vote. For example, Texas, it's one of the most difficult states to vote. Texas is, because we have so many rules around voting. And then what that tends to do is it makes gerrymandering worse because it makes it harder for voters to kind of exercise their right and their will because of how the districts are drawn. And then you elect a political party that maybe is not representative of the majority of voters into power, and then they can pass more laws that kind of worsen that. One suggestion to end gerrymandering: using computers. So this is kind of interesting. A lot of statistical models created by mathematicians have kind of been promoted to try to draw districts. For example, the state of North Carolina in their redistricting, because they were actually one of the states that was involved in that 2019 Supreme Court case, they actually commissioned people to come in and draw a whole bunch of different computer modeled maps to try to find districts that were more fair and less gerrymandered, because they got in trouble for gerrymandering. So there's lots of people who suggest, okay, we'll just like plug all this population information and voting habits and things into a computer model and have it spit out districts that are competitive. Okay? Or use computers to detect when gerrymandering has happened. Now, this sounds appealing, but what maybe is a danger of using computers here? Why will computers probably not fix our gerrymandering? Right, there are still humans involved. Thomas says programmers can skew the program. Absolutely. Then there's the issue of there's different kinds of gerrymandering. So if you are focused on creating competitive districts, that's one thing. If you're focused on protecting the rights of certain minority groups, then that's something that's maybe not necessarily compatible with your purely competitive electoral districts. In other words, there's lots of different factors. There's lots of different room for kind of human error or bias into these computer modeling systems. So there's no kind of one easy, hard and fast rule. The United States struggles the most of any nation with gerrymandering currently. A lot of places have embraced the idea of independent commissions to try to end gerrymandering. Canada did that several years ago, and that has greatly decreased the partisan nature of gerrymandering there. The United States is still struggling with it. And again, kind of how gerrymandering looks for the next decade is going to depend on the outcome of our current election in the year 2020. So that is gerrymandering. Any questions? So we got our start with this weird salamander political cartoon and satire article, right? And we're still dealing with this today. No questions? You guys are dumbfounded? Confused still? By the way, if you want to see how wacky some of these districts can be, go to Google slate.com and gerrymandering. They did a series of different states, and they actually had it so that you had to put it together like a puzzle, how the districts fit together. Some of them are really weird. Yep, Thomas says, if you have no electoral college, then you have no gerrymandering. Simple solution. Government for the people, by the people. Getting rid of the electoral college would kind of solve the federal sort of elections issue, but you still have gerrymandering that's happening at the state level. Because remember, like as we go to the polls in Texas now, right, we're in the middle of early voting, we're still kind of constricted by the districts that have been drawn by gerrymandering, right? So that's going to affect who we elect. So you really have to, like, talking about the Electoral College is definitely a conversation a lot of people have had, right? Because they're frustrated by the fact that so many of our recent elections, one candidate's won the popular vote, but then the other candidate becomes president because of the Electoral College. But really, to fix gerrymandering, we're also going to have to focus on reforms at the state level, because so long as we have state level gerrymandering, that's going to continue to shape who's elected to Washington and the legislator. And that's going to continue to kind of have an impact on other things, like, for example, Supreme Court and court system appointments. Other questions, comments, concerns? So this is one of many reasons it's very important to vote and to educate yourself on this, because this is something that we have been dealing with now for over 200 years, right? And like I said, we can kind of look to other countries and how they've tried to deal with the system of gerrymandering there. But this is something that is going to require a lot of work and a lot of sort of complex behind the scenes maneuvering before we figure out a solution to this.